Everything was calm, peaceful, as it always was on this particular morning. Mark stood at the window, a hot cup of coffee in hand, watching as his wife, Sarah, set up their small flower stand on the front lawn. The aroma of freshly cut roses and lilies filled the air, mixing perfectly with the crisp morning breeze. It was a ritual for them, something they did every weekend, taking pride in their little business and the beauty it brought to the neighborhood. The kids, Mia and Jake, were playing on the porch, laughing as they chased each other around in the early morning light. Mark couldn't help but smile at the simple joy of it all: family, flowers, and the freedom of a peaceful weekend. They didn't expect much, just a few sales to make the day feel worthwhile, a few friendly chats with neighbors. But then, the peace shattered. Out of nowhere, a car screeched to a halt in front of their house. The tires left a screeching mark on the asphalt as the door slammed open. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He could see her, the woman they had been hearing about, but never actually met. Karen, the HOA president, the woman who seemed to have an opinion about everything in their neighborhood. The same woman who had made countless complaints about their flower stand, their fence, the way their mailbox was positioned. She stormed towards their front yard, her expression twisted with anger, her footsteps sharp on the pavement. The calm morning was gone, replaced by the tension hanging in the air. Sarah, who was adjusting a vase of sunflowers on the stand, didn't notice Karen approaching at first. But when she did, her smile faded. Mark's hand tightened around the coffee mug, his stomach sinking. Without warning, Karen yelled, "This is a violation. You're not supposed to have this here. You're in direct defiance of HOA rules, and I'll make sure it stops." Sarah stood frozen for a moment, stunned. This wasn't the first time Karen had voiced complaints about their stand, but something about her tone, her fury, was different today. Mark quickly walked outside, his voice steady but firm as he tried to defuse the situation. "Karen, please, we're just trying to make a little extra for our kids." "It's harmless," he explained, but his words barely reached her. Her eyes narrowed, and her hand reached into her purse. "I've had enough of your disregard for the rules. You've been warned," she spat, pulling something from her bag, an axe. The sight of it, so out of place, caught Mark off guard. Sarah gasped, backing away, but Karen's eyes were focused on the flowers, her target. Without hesitation, Karen swung the axe at the stand. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. The kids, still playing on the porch, were too far away to understand what was happening. But Mark saw the axe raise, and for a split second, everything froze. Time seemed to stretch out, each second lasting an eternity. "I never imagined it would go this far. But here we were, on the edge of something unthinkable." Mark's voice echoed in his mind as he dashed forward, adrenaline coursing through him. This was no longer a simple neighborhood dispute. This was something that could destroy everything. The flower stand. Their family. The peace they had worked so hard to build. Mark and Sarah had always dreamed of living in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. After years of moving from city to city, chasing jobs and opportunities, they finally found a home in Cedarwood Heights, a quiet community with tree-lined streets and neighbors who waved at each other as they passed. It was the kind of place where kids played outside until the streetlights came on, and the evenings were filled with the hum of lawnmowers and the scent of barbecues. Mark worked as a freelance graphic designer, while Sarah ran a small but thriving flower business from home. She had always loved plants, her mother's garden had been her sanctuary growing up, and she had brought that passion into their family. She spent hours arranging bouquets, planting new flowers in their front yard, and tending to her little business. It was her escape, her way of creating something beautiful in the world, and Mark was always supportive. He loved seeing the joy Sarah's flowers brought to the neighborhood. It started as a small side hustle, a few bunches of flowers set up on a modest stand at the end of their driveway. Nothing too flashy, just a simple way to share her love for flowers with the world. But as the weeks went by, the flower stand became more popular. Neighbors stopped by to buy fresh flowers, and Sarah even started taking orders for bouquets at local events. It wasn't a big operation, but it was enough to make a little extra money and brighten up their corner of the world. At first, everything seemed perfect. Sarah's flowers made the neighborhood look even more vibrant, and the kids, Mia and Jake, loved playing in the yard, helping their mom water the plants and arrange the bouquets. It felt like a dream come true. They were living in a friendly, tight-knit community, and life was good. But then came Karen. Karen was the president of the Cedarwood Heights Homeowners Association, HOA, a position that carried a certain level of power and authority. No one knew much about her personal life, except that she had lived in the neighborhood for years and seemed to have a never-ending list of rules and regulations. She was always quick to point out when someone's lawn wasn't up to her standards or when a neighbor was violating the HOA's strict guidelines. Sarah had heard of Karen through whispers at block parties and casual conversations with the neighbors, but they had never crossed paths, until the flower stand. It started innocuously enough. One morning, as Sarah was arranging a fresh batch of lilies on the stand, Karen came marching up the sidewalk. Her eyes were sharp, and her expression was one of quiet disapproval. At first, Sarah thought she was just another neighbor passing by, but when Karen stopped in front of the stand, Sarah felt the tension in the air. "Nice flowers," Karen said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I'm afraid you can't be selling them here. It's against HOA policy." Sarah was caught off guard. She had no idea there was an issue. She had seen other neighbors sell things from their yards before, garage sales, lemonade stands, but she hadn't expected the HOA to come down on her. She tried to explain politely, offering to check any rules or guidelines, but Karen was insistent. "No exceptions," Karen said curtly, before turning on her heel and walking away. Sarah was confused. She didn't think selling flowers on her own property could be a violation of anything. But she let it go, assuming Karen had made a mistake or misunderstood something. She decided to check with the HOA later and make sure everything was in order. She never imagined this would escalate. But as the weeks went on, Karen's complaints didn't stop. Every time Sarah set up the flower stand, Karen seemed to find something new to criticize, whether it was the position of the stand, the color of the flowers, or how often Sarah left the stand unattended. It became a game of cat and mouse. Every time Sarah thought she had followed the rules, Karen would show up again, pointing out another small infraction. Sarah began to feel the weight of Karen's constant presence. She could feel the tension building, and it started to wear on her. Her once peaceful hobby had turned into a source of stress. She tried to explain to Mark how difficult it was to keep up with Karen's demands, but Mark, always the optimist, reassured her that it would blow over. He believed it was just a phase, some weird quarrel over garden flowers. But it wasn't. It was something much bigger. As Sarah struggled with the ongoing tension, the kids began to notice the change. Mia, always the curious one, asked why they couldn't have the flowers out front anymore. Jake, who usually found joy in their little garden, grew quieter, sensing the unease. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary was now filled with frustration. Sarah's passion for the flowers began to fade, replaced by anxiety. Every morning, she wondered if it would be the day Karen would show up again, demanding another change, another rule to follow. The more Sarah tried to be accommodating, the more Karen pushed. There was no compromise, no understanding. And with each passing day, it became clearer, this wasn't about the flowers at all. It was about control. The peace Sarah and Mark had once taken for granted began to slip away, piece by piece, as Karen's hostility grew. They had no idea that one simple disagreement could snowball into something that would threaten to tear their family apart. And then, one fateful morning, it all came to a head. It was an unremarkable Tuesday morning when the first true confrontation between Sarah and Karen took place. The kids were still in school, and Mark was out at a meeting. Sarah had just finished arranging a fresh batch of sunflowers and daisies at their flower stand, carefully trimming the stems and adding a bit of water to keep them fresh for the day. The stand had become more than just a business, it was Sarah's therapy, her way of finding peace in the midst of the growing tension in their neighborhood. She didn't expect anything unusual that morning, just a typical day of setting up the stand, greeting friendly neighbors, and perhaps making a few sales. But that peaceful morning would be shattered when the sound of tires screeching to a halt echoed down the street. Sarah glanced up, her heart sinking when she saw Karen's car parked at the curb, its engine still running. Karen, as always, was getting out of the car with an air of authority, her eyes already narrowed as she approached the stand. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, wondering if this would be yet another one of those fleeting complaints that Karen had casually tossed her way over the past few weeks. But this time, Sarah could sense something was different. Without even greeting Sarah, Karen began her tirade. "You've been warned before," Karen snapped, her voice cold and firm. "You cannot keep this flower stand here. It's against HOA rules. And you've been violating them for far too long." Sarah's stomach twisted. She had tried to follow every rule, checked the guidelines Karen had emailed her, and made sure her stand was positioned just right. But there was no reasoning with Karen. She had already made up her mind. "I'm not violating anything," Sarah replied, her voice steady but edged with the frustration she was trying so hard to hold back. "I've checked the rules. The stand is on my property, and I'm not obstructing anyone's view or walkway. I'm doing this for fun and for the community. It's harmless." But Karen wasn't listening. She had made it clear from the start that she didn't care about the facts or Sarah's intentions. "You're still in violation. And I'll make sure you pay for this," Karen sneered, her eyes burning with a cold fury. "I'm reporting you to the HOA board. This isn't just a minor issue anymore. I've had enough." Sarah could feel the tension rising between them. She tried to keep her composure, but Karen's presence was like a looming storm cloud, casting a shadow over everything she had worked so hard for. "I've followed every rule," Sarah insisted. "You can't just threaten me without cause." "Oh, I can," Karen said, her voice dripping with venom. "You think your little flowers are cute, but they're ruining the image of this neighborhood. We have standards to uphold here. You've broken them, and now you'll pay the price." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just about flowers anymore. It was about control, about Karen's desire to impose her will on everyone around her. Sarah felt a rush of anger rising within her, but she knew she had to stay calm for the sake of her family. She couldn't afford to let Karen get under her skin, especially with the kids due home from school in a few hours. "I'll talk to the HOA myself," Sarah said, her voice cool and controlled, though the frustration in her chest was bubbling to the surface. "But this is my property, and I have every right to do what I want with it." Karen took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "You think you can get away with this? You're a few steps away from a full investigation. Don't think I won't get the entire HOA on your case. If you don't shut this down, I will personally make sure they come after you." For a moment, Sarah stood there, speechless. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had heard rumors of Karen's ruthlessness, but this was more than she could have ever imagined. This wasn't just a petty squabble anymore. This was a full-blown war, one that Karen was determined to win, no matter the cost. "I'll be watching," Karen said coldly before turning on her heel and walking back to her car. As Sarah watched Karen drive away, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She stood there, staring at the flowers, her hands trembling. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was a battle she hadn't asked for but was now forced to face. The feeling of dread crept over her, and she couldn't shake the thought that this was only the beginning. The weeks that followed the first confrontation between Sarah and Karen were filled with an escalating sense of unease. Sarah had tried to ignore the mounting tension, focusing instead on her flowers and the small business she had worked so hard to create. But Karen's presence loomed over their lives like a shadow, a constant reminder that things were far from resolved. Sarah did her best to stay calm, hoping that the situation would blow over. She even attended a few HOA meetings, trying to get some clarity on the rules and to show that she was willing to comply. But every time Karen saw her, the look of disdain was unmistakable. Karen wasn't going to back down. It wasn't long before Sarah noticed a pattern. Karen's complaints were no longer just about the flower stand's location or the occasional misplaced vase. They were becoming more personal, more invasive. She started showing up at odd hours, inspecting the stand with a look of disgust. Sarah would try to explain that she was following all the rules, but Karen would ignore her and simply mutter something about rule violations before walking off, always leaving a sense of dread in her wake. One afternoon, as Sarah was arranging a fresh batch of tulips on the stand, she saw Karen's car pull up. But this time, something was different. Karen wasn't alone. She was carrying a large, ominous-looking object. Sarah squinted in the afternoon sun, trying to make sense of what Karen was holding. It was too large to be a bag, too bulky to be anything but an axe. Panic shot through Sarah's chest. Her heart began to race as she watched Karen approach, her determined stride unwavering. The kids, Mia and Jake, were in the backyard, playing on the swings, unaware of the impending danger. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but the dread in her gut wouldn't subside. Karen's behavior was unpredictable, and she had no idea what the woman was truly capable of. "Karen, what are you doing?" Sarah called out, her voice shaking, trying to keep the panic out of it. But Karen didn't respond. She was focused on the flower stand, her eyes fixed on it with an almost fanatical intensity. Without warning, Karen raised the axe, aiming it directly at the stand. "Karen, stop!" Sarah screamed, rushing forward, her heart pounding in her chest. But it was too late. With a sickening thud, the axe came down, striking the wooden frame of the stand with all its might. The flowers, Sarah's pride and joy, were scattered in all directions. The delicate petals of the tulips and lilies flew through the air like confetti, their beauty destroyed in an instant. Sarah's stomach dropped as she watched in horror. But the worst part was yet to come. The kids, hearing the noise, had stopped playing. They were standing at the back door, peering out at the scene unfolding before them. "No!" Sarah cried, her voice barely above a whisper. The sight of Karen swinging the axe, so casually destroying everything they had worked for, made her feel as if the world was falling apart. Karen swung again, and this time, the axe buried deep into the wood, splintering it with terrifying force. She was methodical, as if she had done this 1,000 times before, as if this act of destruction was the only thing that mattered. But Sarah couldn't just stand there. She knew she had to protect her family, protect the life they had built. The fear that had paralyzed her earlier was replaced by a surge of adrenaline. She sprinted forward, reaching Karen just as the woman raised the axe for a third strike. Without thinking, Sarah pushed Karen out of the way, her hands trembling but her resolve stronger than ever. The axe missed its mark and landed in the grass beside them. The ground was wet from the recent rain, and Sarah's boots sank slightly into the mud. She turned to face Karen, her chest heaving with the effort of her sudden burst of movement. "Get away from my family!" Sarah shouted, her voice breaking the silence of the neighborhood. Her heart raced, but her voice was steady with the strength of someone who had reached the edge of their endurance. For a moment, there was a stillness. Sarah was standing in front of the wreckage of her flower stand, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Karen stood several feet away, the axe still in her hand. The look on Karen's face was unreadable, cold, detached, almost satisfied. She wasn't the least bit surprised by Sarah's outburst. "Do you really think you can stop me?" Karen sneered. "You've been warned. You can't just do whatever you want around here." Sarah could barely hear her words over the pounding of her own heart. She felt like she was in a nightmare, trapped in a fight she never asked for, yet here she was, defending everything she held dear. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" Sarah's voice cracked with desperation. "This is my property. You can't just destroy everything I've worked for." Karen took a step forward, her grip on the axe tightening. "You'll learn, just like the rest of them," she said coldly, before turning and walking back toward her car, her eyes flashing with anger. "I'm not done with you yet." As Karen drove away, Sarah stood there, shaking, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The sight of her destroyed flower stand, the wreckage of something that had once brought her so much joy, felt like a punch to the gut. But it wasn't just the stand. It was the feeling of helplessness, the realization that her family was no longer safe, that the war Karen had started was only just beginning. Mia and Jake, who had watched the whole scene unfold from the backyard, ran toward her, their faces pale with fear. "Mom, is everything okay?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. Sarah knelt down, pulling them into a hug. She didn't know how to explain what had just happened, or how to keep them safe in a neighborhood that had suddenly turned hostile. But she knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning. The morning had started like any other, with the sun shining through the trees and a light breeze in the air. But that calm was shattered in an instant. Mark had been working on his laptop, his mind focused on a project, when he heard the sudden screech of tires. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized the sound. It was Karen's car, pulling up outside their house. He stood up, already feeling the weight of the tension in the pit of his stomach. He knew something was off. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel it. He glanced toward the front window just in time to see Karen exit the car, carrying something large in her hands. For a split second, he thought it was just another confrontation, another empty threat. But then his eyes locked on the axe she was holding, her face twisted in fury, her grip on the handle as tight as steel. In that moment, the world seemed to slow down. Mark's breath caught in his chest as the reality of the situation hit him like a truck. This was no longer just a dispute over flowers. This was a violent escalation. "Sarah!" Mark shouted, his voice filled with panic. He ran toward the door, heart racing. But he was too late. Karen was already approaching the flower stand, her eyes fixed on it like a predator zeroing in on its prey. Sarah, who had been standing in the yard, arranging a fresh bouquet of roses, froze when she saw Karen's determined expression and the weapon in her hands. Her mind raced as she realized what was happening. "No, Karen, please. Stop!" Sarah screamed, her voice shaking with fear. But Karen didn't stop. She raised the axe high above her head, her face set with cold determination. Without warning, the blade came crashing down onto the flower stand. The sound of the axe hitting the wood was deafening, a sickening thud that echoed in the quiet neighborhood. Sarah recoiled, her heart in her throat, as she watched in horror. The beautiful arrangement of flowers that had taken hours to put together was obliterated in a single strike. The force of the blow sent shards of wood flying, and the flowers scattered in every direction, their delicate petals torn apart by the violent impact. "Karen, what are you doing?" Sarah shouted, running toward her, but she couldn't stop her. Karen's rage was palpable, her every movement filled with an almost manic energy. She wasn't done. With a furious scream, Karen raised the axe again, preparing for another strike. The swing was wild, almost frantic, and Sarah couldn't avoid it. She darted to the side, narrowly missing the blade as it slashed through the air. But Karen wasn't finished. She swung again, the axe coming down so hard that it splintered the wood of the stand even further. Mark's heart raced as he watched from the window. His instincts kicked in. "No, not like this," he muttered under his breath, his body already in motion. He dashed toward the door, his mind only focused on one thing: getting to his family before it was too late. As he burst through the door and ran toward the yard, he saw his worst fear unfolding before his eyes. Karen, in her frenzy, was moments away from swinging the axe a third time. Sarah was backing away, her arms raised in an attempt to shield herself from the madness. The kids, Mia and Jake, were standing on the porch, their wide eyes filled with confusion and terror, not yet understanding the full extent of the danger. But they could feel it. The tension in the air was thick, heavy, and it made Mark's blood run cold. "Mom! What's happening?" Mia cried, her voice trembling. She clutched Jake's hand, her grip so tight it made his knuckles white. Mark's heart nearly stopped when he saw Karen raise the axe for the third strike, her eyes locked on Sarah. Time seemed to stretch out as Mark sprinted across the yard, his every step fueled by the desperate need to protect his family. He wasn't going to let Karen hurt Sarah, and he certainly wasn't going to let her hurt the kids. In that moment, everything else disappeared. The world was just him, running toward the woman he loved, the woman who had given him a family, the woman who had worked so hard to make their lives beautiful, and the children who meant everything to him. "Sarah! Move!" Mark shouted, his voice hoarse as he rushed forward. He could see her struggling to get out of the way, but Karen's axe was already in motion, and it was coming down fast. Without thinking, Mark threw himself at Sarah, knocking her out of the path of the axe. The blade came down just inches from where she had been standing, the sound of it slicing through the air sharp and terrifying. He didn't have time to think. All that mattered was getting her to safety. "Run!" Mark yelled, his hands trembling as he pulled Sarah to her feet and pushed her toward the kids. The fear in her eyes mirrored his own, but there was no time to speak, no time to explain. They needed to get out of there before it was too late. As Mark turned to face Karen, he saw the madness in her eyes. She was breathing heavily now, her face flushed with rage and something darker, something that scared him more than the axe she was holding. She was completely unhinged. There was no reasoning with her now. "Stay away from my family!" Mark shouted, his voice raw with emotion. But Karen wasn't listening. She took another step toward him, the axe raised again, and for a moment, Mark thought this might be it. He braced himself for the impact, but before Karen could swing the axe, a voice rang out from behind him. "Hey!" The voice was loud and authoritative, one Mark recognized immediately. It was their neighbor, Mr. Daniels, from 2 doors down, rushing toward them with his phone in hand. He must have called the police. The sight of him was enough to cause Karen to pause, her axe hovering in midair. "What the hell is going on here, Karen?" Mr. Daniels demanded, his voice filled with disbelief. Karen hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking from Mr. Daniels to Mark, and then back to the weapon in her hands. The grip on the axe loosened slightly, but her eyes still burned with fury. The moment of hesitation was all Mark needed. With everything he had, he lunged forward and wrestled the axe from Karen's hands. The weapon hit the ground with a loud clatter, but Karen didn't back down. She tried to break free from Mark's grasp, her hands clawing at him, but he held firm, forcing her to the ground. "Enough!" Mark shouted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "This ends now." It wasn't over yet. The police were on their way, and Karen was not about to walk away unscathed. But for now, Mark had his family. They were safe. And that was all that mattered. The sound of the police sirens echoed through the quiet neighborhood, growing louder as they neared the scene. Mark stood near the flower stand, his body still tense, adrenaline coursing through him. His hands shook slightly, but the worst was over. The axe was no longer in Karen's hands, and his family was safe, for now. The kids were still on the porch, huddled together, their wide eyes following every movement. Mia's face was pale, and Jake, who had been so full of energy just hours earlier, stood completely still, his little hands clutched tightly in his mother's. Sarah held them both close, trying to comfort them, but her own hands were trembling. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the trauma of what had just happened settling in. "Mark, are they going to be okay?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper, but the fear in her eyes was undeniable. She was trying to stay strong for the kids, but the raw emotion of the situation was starting to catch up with her. "They're going to be fine," Mark said, forcing a calmness he didn't quite feel. "The police will sort it out." But even as he spoke, the weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on his shoulders. He never imagined something like this could happen in their quiet, peaceful neighborhood. He had always believed that they were safe here, that their little family could live without fear. Now, it seemed that everything had changed in an instant. The flashing lights of the police cars finally arrived, and officers stepped out, quickly assessing the scene. They made their way over to Karen, who had been restrained and was sitting on the curb, a look of defiance on her face. She was shaking slightly, but it wasn't from fear, it was from anger, from the frustration of having lost control. Mark could hear her muttering, her words barely audible. "I had to do it," Karen was saying. "They were breaking the rules. The HOA needs order. It was for the good of the neighborhood. They don't understand what I'm trying to protect." Mark's blood boiled as he heard her words, but he held back. He couldn't let his anger get the best of him now. There was too much at stake. The police were already taking statements from the neighbors who had witnessed the event. Mr. Daniels was one of the first to be questioned. He had arrived just in time to stop the chaos from escalating further. "I've never seen anything like it," Mr. Daniels said, his voice shaking with disbelief. Karen just snapped. "I've known her for years, and I've never seen her like this. I had no idea it was going to turn violent." The officers nodded, taking notes. They were methodical, asking Sarah to recount the events in as much detail as possible. Mark stood nearby, occasionally glancing at the children, who were still trying to process everything that had happened. Sarah spoke with a clarity that shocked even her, recounting how Karen had shown up with the axe, how she had tried to stop her, and how Mark had intervened just in time. "I never thought we'd be here, fighting for our right to live peacefully," Sarah said, her voice wavering slightly. "We just wanted to share something beautiful with the neighborhood. I never thought it would lead to something like this." The police officer nodded sympathetically. "It's unfortunate, ma'am. We'll do everything we can to get to the bottom of this. But you're both safe now, and that's what matters." Karen's defense was as rigid as ever. She claimed that her actions were justified, that she had done what needed to be done to preserve the integrity of the neighborhood. Her words felt hollow in the face of what had just occurred, but she wasn't ready to admit the truth, that she had let her obsession with control and power spiral out of hand. "I just want things to be right again," Karen kept repeating. "This neighborhood, it's falling apart. People like them," she gestured toward Sarah and Mark, "don't respect the rules. They think they can do whatever they want, and I'm the only one who cares enough to stop them." Her words didn't make sense, but that didn't stop her from repeating them. The officers didn't seem convinced by her justification. They continued to take down her statements, and it was clear to everyone watching that Karen's actions were far from rational. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about something deeper, something that had been building for a long time. Mark and Sarah had become the unfortunate targets of that obsession. As the police continued their investigation, Mark couldn't shake the weight of what had just happened. He glanced at the broken flower stand, the wreckage of something that had once brought their family so much joy. The scene felt surreal, like it belonged in some other world, not the one they had built for themselves. But it was real. And it had changed everything. Later that evening, as the police left and the neighborhood began to settle down, Mark and Sarah sat down with the kids. They hadn't said much to each other, but there was a heaviness in the air that no one could ignore. The kids were finally able to let go of their fear and started asking questions. "Mom, why did she do that?" Mia asked, her voice small, full of confusion. Sarah held her tightly, trying to find the right words. "Sometimes, people act out of fear or anger. It doesn't make sense, but that's what happened today. But you're safe now. That's all that matters. Mark looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with exhaustion and concern. The police had assured them that Karen would be facing charges, but it didn't feel like enough. The damage had been done. Their sense of safety, their belief that they could live peacefully in their own home, had been shattered. No matter how much time passed, they would never look at their front yard in the same way again. As the night stretched on, the weight of the day began to sink in. The flowers, once a symbol of peace and beauty, were now nothing more than a reminder of the violence that had invaded their lives. They had fought to protect their family, but the emotional toll of the event would linger long after the investigation was over. "I'm just glad you're all okay," Mark said, his voice quiet, almost like a prayer. Sarah nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She couldn't yet process the magnitude of what had happened, but she knew one thing for certain: life would never be the same. They had fought for their peace, and they would continue to fight. But it wouldn't be easy. The weeks following Karen's violent attack on their flower stand were a blur of police reports, neighborhood gossip, and the steady hum of legal procedures. Mark and Sarah did their best to keep life as normal as possible for the kids. They attended therapy sessions to help them cope with the trauma, though there were times when they would catch Mia staring out the window, her face still filled with confusion and fear. Jake, usually so full of energy, had become quieter, a stark contrast to the carefree child he had been. The peace they had once enjoyed seemed irretrievably lost, like a distant memory they could no longer grasp. Despite their best efforts to move forward, the damage was undeniable. Every time Sarah stepped outside, she couldn't help but glance at the spot where the flower stand had once stood, the ground still scarred from the destruction. She had tried to rebuild it once, but the act of arranging the flowers no longer brought the same joy it once had. Every petal, every stem, felt like a symbol of the anger and violence that had torn through their lives. She couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's rage was still lingering in the air, watching over them like a dark cloud. The legal system had moved slowly but steadily. Karen was arrested the day of the incident, and she was charged with vandalism, aggravated assault, and the use of a weapon with intent to harm. The police had gathered enough evidence from the scene, including witness statements and video footage from the neighbors' security cameras, to make a solid case. Karen's defense was weak. She tried to claim that she was defending the neighborhood's values, and that her actions were an act of preserving order. But the police didn't buy it, and neither did the court. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Karen's behavior became more erratic. She sent multiple letters to Sarah and Mark, trying to justify her actions, claiming that she had done the right thing, and that they were the ones who had pushed her too far. These letters were full of venom, written in a way that made it clear she believed she was the victim. Sarah and Mark didn't respond, but each letter sent another wave of disgust through them. How could someone who had caused so much destruction not even be capable of seeing the harm she had done? The trial began on a cold November morning. Mark and Sarah sat in the courtroom, their hearts heavy with the weight of what had happened. They had spent so much time trying to protect their family and shield their children from the worst of it, but now, they had to face the reality of the situation. Karen, sitting across from them, was calm, almost too calm. She didn't seem remorseful, didn't show any sign of regret. Her eyes, cold and calculating, never left Sarah and Mark, as though daring them to challenge her. When it was Sarah's turn to testify, she stood up, her voice steady despite the overwhelming emotions that threatened to choke her. She spoke of the flower stand, of how it had started as something simple, something that brought their family joy. She spoke of the attack, of how Karen had threatened her, of the fear she felt when the axe came down, destroying everything she had worked for. But she didn't just speak of the destruction. She spoke of the damage done to their sense of security, of how the attack had broken the peace in their home and left them questioning everything they had taken for granted. "I never thought it would go this far," Sarah said, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. "We didn't want to be enemies. We just wanted to live in peace. But Karen's actions have changed everything. She took away more than just my flowers. She took away our sense of safety. And for that, I don't know how to move forward." The courtroom was silent. Karen's lawyer attempted to cross-examine Sarah, but his questions were weak, lacking the force needed to challenge her testimony. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury could see the truth of Sarah's words. Karen had gone too far, and there was no justifying her actions. When the verdict was finally read, Mark and Sarah sat in stunned silence. Karen was found guilty on all charges. She was sentenced to 5 years of probation, with the condition that she undergo anger management therapy and perform community service. The judge also ordered her to pay restitution for the damage to the flower stand and for the emotional distress caused to the family. It wasn't the harshest sentence, but it was a measure of justice. Karen had been held accountable, and she could no longer claim to be above the law. As Sarah and Mark walked out of the courtroom, hand in hand, they felt a mix of emotions: relief, anger, but most of all, a quiet sense of closure. Justice had been served, but it didn't feel like the victory they had hoped for. There was no satisfaction in seeing Karen punished. No part of them felt vindicated. They had simply wanted to be left in peace, to go back to the life they had before the chaos. But they knew that wasn't possible now. "I don't know if I can ever forgive her," Sarah said quietly as they stepped out into the cold air. "But I know this wasn't about revenge. It was about standing up for what's right." Mark nodded, his arm around her shoulders as they walked. "Exactly. We did what we had to do. For us. For the kids. For our family." The resolution of the trial marked the end of the immediate threat to their safety, but it was clear that the scars from this experience would take much longer to heal. Their lives had been forever altered by the actions of one person, someone who had let her need for control destroy the lives of those around her. But as they walked down the steps of the courthouse, hand in hand, they both knew that they had fought not for revenge, but for justice, for their right to live in peace. It wasn't over. But it was a start. And that was enough. If you felt the tension, the fear, and the raw emotions of this story, don't let it stop here. The journey of standing up for what's right continues, and your voice matters. If you believe in fighting for justice, in standing strong when faced with adversity, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with others who need to hear that standing up against injustice is always worth it. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more powerful, real-life stories like this. Let's keep the conversation going, and together, let's ensure that no one ever feels powerless again. Your support can help make a difference, one story at a time.